They uninvited me from Christmas. In front of my parents. And that was the moment everything changed, because I decided I was done being the family's punching bag. Here I am, 34 years old, sitting in my quiet living room this Christmas morning. The coffee in my hand probably costs more per pound than my sister Eleanor's monthly wine budget, and you know what? I feel absolutely zero regret. Let me take you back to how this all started, because you need the full picture to understand how someone's entire world crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. I'm the younger sister, by 4 years. My older sister, Eleanor, has always operated under the assumption that birth order equals importance. She married Brendan 8 years ago, and together they've perfected the art of treating family gatherings like personal fundraising events disguised as holiday cheer. Growing up, our family dynamics were complicated. It took me years of therapy to truly understand them. Our mother, Patricia, always had this soft spot for Eleanor that bordered on obsession. Our father, Robert, was more balanced, but he learned early on that disagreeing with Patricia about anything related to us meant sleeping on the couch for weeks, enduring passive-aggressive comments about his inability to understand maternal bonds. Eleanor could do no wrong. When she crashed our parents' car at 17, it was because the brakes were faulty. When I got a B+ in honors chemistry, it was because I wasn't applying myself. Eleanor dropping out of her first college to find herself was a brave journey of self-discovery. My taking a gap year before grad school to travel and gain perspective? That was evidence of my lack of direction. I stopped keeping score by the time I was 22. What was the point? The game was rigged. There's this one memory that crystallizes everything. I was 14, Eleanor was 18, and we were both in the running for a summer arts program that only accepted one student per family. It required a portfolio, an essay, and a teacher recommendation. I worked on my portfolio for 3 months, staying after school, using the art room supplies, spending my allowance on good paper. I revised my essay 11 times until every sentence gleamed. My art teacher, Ms. Davis, wrote me a 3-page letter of genuine praise that made me cry in the school bathroom when she let me read it. Eleanor threw her application together in a weekend. Her portfolio was decent, but uninspired. Her essay was riddled with grammatical errors she couldn't be bothered to fix. But she was graduating that spring, and our mother decided this program would be the perfect send-off before college. The night before applications were due, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table. Robert was working late, conveniently absent from what was about to unfold. "I need you to withdraw your application," Patricia said, her voice that particular soft tone she used when delivering non-negotiable demands. "What? Why?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Eleanor needs this more than you do. She's about to start a new chapter, and this program would give her confidence going into college. You're only 14. You'll have other chances." "But I worked so hard. And that work ethic will serve you well in future applications." My mother reached across the table and patted my hand, like she was offering comfort instead of crushing something I'd built with my own dedication. This is what sisters do for each other. One day, Eleanor will sacrifice something for you, and it will all balance out. I withdrew my application. Eleanor got into the program. She dropped out after 2 weeks because it was too structured and stifled her creativity. My mother spun this as evidence of Eleanor's artistic spirit being too wild to be contained. I never applied to that program again. By the following summer, the rejection had calcified into something I didn't want to examine too closely. The balancing my mother promised never came. Eleanor never sacrificed anything for me, not once in 30 years. Every time I brought it up, my mother had an excuse ready. Eleanor had more responsibilities now. Eleanor was going through a difficult time. Eleanor needed support that I was strong enough to provide for myself. My strength became its own punishment. Because I could handle disappointment without breaking down, I was expected to absorb endless amounts of it. Because I didn't demand attention, I was given none. Because I built a life that didn't depend on anyone else's validation, my family assumed I didn't need to be included in theirs. Fast forward 3 years ago. I was 31, had just received a significant promotion at my consulting firm, and had purchased my first home. Not an apartment, not a condo, but an actual house with a yard, a garage, and enough space to host the entire family for holidays, if I wanted to. That's the key phrase. The house became a new battleground in ways I hadn't anticipated. Eleanor and Brendan were still renting a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that could generously be called up and coming. They had 2 kids by then, Chloe, who was 6, and Daisy, who was 3. The apartment was bursting with toys, resentment, and unfulfilled expectations. Now, 3 years later, Chloe was 9, and Daisy had just turned 6. The apartment hadn't gotten any bigger, but Eleanor's sense of entitlement certainly had. What made the situation more complicated was the unspoken assumption that I should have been helping them financially. Eleanor hinted at it multiple times, dropping comments about how difficult it was to save for a down payment while raising children, how some people had the luxury of focusing solely on their careers without the burden of family responsibilities. Each comment was a small grenade, lobbed in my direction, designed to explode my sense of accomplishment into guilt. Brendan was even less subtle. At one family dinner, he openly suggested that since I had all that extra space, maybe Chloe could stay with me during summer breaks to give them some breathing room. When I politely declined, citing my work travel schedule, he muttered something about selfishness that he clearly intended for me to hear. My mother's response to these dynamics was predictable. She'd pull me aside and explain how hard things were for Eleanor, how Brendan's job in middle management didn't pay as well as they'd hoped, how the children deserved better than what their parents could currently provide. The implication was always clear: I should be doing more, giving more, sacrificing more to make Eleanor's life easier. I'd already given them $5,000 as a wedding gift, paid for Eleanor's baby shower, and covered the cost of Daisy's first birthday party when their budget fell through at the last minute. None of these contributions were ever acknowledged beyond a perfunctory thank you card that arrived weeks late. But I was supposed to keep giving, keep enabling, keep proving I understood my place in the family hierarchy. The first Thanksgiving at my new house should have been a warning sign. Eleanor spent the entire evening commenting on everything from my choice of countertops to the thread count of my guest towels. Brendan made snide remarks about how nice it must be to have disposable income when you don't have children. My mother nodded along with every criticism like a bobblehead at a rock concert. My father, Robert, pulled me aside that night and apologized quietly. He told me he was proud of me, that he knew my success came from hard work and sacrifice, and that I shouldn't let their comments diminish what I'd accomplished. I hugged him and told him I understood the position he was in. We didn't talk about it again. The following year, Christmas was at my parents' house, as it had been every year since Eleanor and I were children. Their colonial in the suburbs had enough room for everyone, barely, and my mother insisted on maintaining the tradition. I brought wine, homemade desserts, and gifts for everyone. Eleanor brought complaints about the traffic, demands for specific dietary accommodations for the kids, and a wrapped present for me that turned out to be a self-help book about finding happiness without material possessions. I smiled, thanked her, and added it to the growing pile of evidence that my sister saw me as a personal challenge to overcome, rather than a sibling to love. Last summer, everything changed. The shift began before the infamous barbecue, though I didn't recognize it at the time. In May, I'd received a significant bonus at work, recognition for a project I'd led that had exceeded all performance metrics. I mentioned it casually at a family lunch, not to brag, but because my father had asked about work, and I was genuinely proud. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her smile froze, her eyes went hard, and she changed the subject within seconds to Chloe's upcoming soccer tournament. My mother followed her lead seamlessly, asking detailed questions about game schedules and team dynamics while my professional achievement evaporated into irrelevance. Later that afternoon, as I was helping clean up the dishes, Eleanor cornered me in the kitchen. "Must be nice," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of sweetness and venom she'd perfected over the years. "Getting rewarded just for doing your job." Some of us don't have the luxury of choosing careers that come with bonuses. Eleanor, you chose to major in communications and then decided not to pursue it professionally. That's not, I chose to prioritize my family, she cut me off sharply. Something you clearly wouldn't understand. Money isn't everything. You know, some of us have things that matter more than a bigger paycheck. I could have pointed out that she complained constantly about not having enough money. I could have mentioned the multiple times she'd asked me to cover expenses she couldn't afford. I could have observed that her dismissal of financial success seemed awfully convenient given her inability to achieve it. Instead, I just nodded and finished drying the plates in silence. Some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when the other person has already decided they're the victim regardless of the facts. But that interaction planted something in me, a seed of awareness that our dynamic wasn't sustainable, that something would eventually have to give. I just didn't expect the breaking point to arrive at a backyard barbecue 2 months later. My parents announced they wanted to do something different for Christmas. After 40 years of hosting in their home, they were tired. They wanted a vacation. Specifically, they wanted to go to Cancun, sun, sand, no cooking or cleaning required. I was thrilled. A break from the traditional dynamics, a chance to relax somewhere beautiful, an opportunity to create new memories that didn't involve my mother's overcooked turkey or Eleanor's annual dramatic retelling of whatever hardship she'd invented that year. Then came the conversation that started everything. We were at my parents' house for a late August barbecue. The kids were playing in the backyard. Brendan was nursing a beer and scrolling through his phone. Eleanor was holding court at the patio table with our mother. I was helping my father flip burgers when Eleanor called me over. "We need to talk about Christmas logistics," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she uses when she's about to deliver instructions rather than have a discussion. I sat down, expecting to coordinate flight times and room arrangements. What I got was something else entirely. "Mom and I have been talking," Eleanor began, "and I noticed my mother nodding already, and we think it would be best if you didn't come to Cancun." I blinked. Surely, I had misheard. "Excuse me?" "The resort has limited availability," Eleanor continued smoothly. "We could only get 2 suites, and with the kids, Brendan and I need one. Mom and Dad will take the other. There's simply no room for you." I looked at my mother. "Is this true?" Patricia at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Well, honey, Eleanor has a point. The children need space, and it's not like you'd have anyone to share with. You'd have to get your own room, and that seems like such a waste of money when you could just celebrate on your own this year." "On my own," I repeated flatly. "You could have a nice, quiet Christmas at your house," my mother suggested brightly. "You love that house. You're always talking about how peaceful it is." I turned to my father, who had walked over with a spatula still in his hand. His expression was troubled, but he said nothing. Decades of training had taught him to stay silent when Patricia and Eleanor formed a united front. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, keeping my voice calm even as something cold settled in my chest. "You're telling me I'm not welcome on the family Christmas vacation because there's not enough room? Even though you haven't even asked me about room arrangements, or whether I'd be willing to book my own accommodations nearby?" "It's not about being welcome," Eleanor said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "It's about practicality. The kids are young. They need attention. And honestly, it would be easier for everyone if we didn't have to worry about including you in activities that are really meant for families with children." The word hung in the air, families. As though I wasn't family. As though my lack of a husband and children somehow demoted me to a subsidiary status that didn't warrant inclusion in holiday plans. "I see," I said quietly. The words hung there, insufficient containers for the enormity of what I was feeling. 30 years of accumulated slights, dismissed accomplishments, and second-class status crystallized into those 2 syllables. My sister had just told me, in front of our parents, that I wasn't really family, and our mother had endorsed it with her silence and her nods. I thought about all the times I'd driven 40 minutes to babysit Chloe and Daisy so Eleanor and Brendan could have date nights. The checks I'd written for birthday presents that were always received with perfunctory thanks. The countless hours I'd spent listening to Eleanor complain about her life while she showed zero interest in mine. The way I quietly paid for groceries when my parents visited because I knew their finances were tighter than they let on, never mentioning it to anyone because I didn't need credit for basic decency. None of it mattered. In Eleanor's calculation of family worth, I was a line item to be eliminated when the budget got tight. My father finally spoke. "Now, hold on, Raymond, Robert." My mother cut him off sharply. "We discussed this. It's already decided." I stood up from the table. The burger on my plate was untouched, and I had no intention of eating it now. "You're right, Eleanor. It is decided." I picked up my purse from where I'd left it by the back door. "Enjoy your trip. I hope it's everything you've planned." I left without another word. My father called after me, but I kept walking. I heard my mother say something about how I was being dramatic, how I'd get over it, how this was typical behavior from someone who had always had trouble sharing attention. I drove home with steady hands and a racing mind. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had the beginning of a plan. The first thing I did was pour myself a glass of wine and sit on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost mocking in their beauty. I replayed the conversation in my head, searching for some interpretation that didn't end with my family essentially disowning me for the holidays. There wasn't one. Eleanor's words had been clear. My mother's support had been unmistakable, and my father's silence had been damning in its own way. I called my friend Sophia, who'd known me since college and had witnessed enough family gatherings to understand the dynamics without lengthy explanation. "They actually said that to your face?" Her voice was sharp with indignation. "At a barbecue? In front of everyone?" "In front of the people who mattered to them," I said. "Which apparently doesn't include me." Sophia exhaled slowly. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. But I'm done pretending it doesn't hurt. I'm done being the good sport who absorbs every slight with a smile. I'm done making myself smaller so Eleanor can feel bigger." "Good. It's about damn time." A pause. "You know I'm here. Whatever you need. You want company for Christmas? My door is open. My family is chaotic, but at least they're equal opportunity chaotic." I laughed despite myself. "I might take you up on that. Can I call you later this week when I've figured out what I'm feeling?" "Call me anytime. And don't let them gaslight you into thinking you're overreacting. What they said was cruel, and you have every right to be furious." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness and let myself feel everything I'd been suppressing at the barbecue. Anger, certainly, but also grief. Grief for the family I'd always wanted and would never have. Grief for the little girl who'd withdrawn her art program application, believing that sacrifice would be reciprocated. Grief for the woman who'd spent decades hoping that eventually, somehow, she'd earn her place at the table. By midnight, the grief had transformed into something harder, colder, more useful: determination. Here's the thing about being the overlooked sibling: you learn to become self-sufficient. You learn that no one is going to hand you anything, that your achievements will be minimized, and your failures magnified. You learn to build your own support systems, cultivate your own resources, and most importantly, you learn to wait. Eleanor had made a critical error. She'd forgotten, or perhaps never knew, that our father had quietly helped me with a down payment on my house. Not because I asked, but because he wanted to do something meaningful for me without my mother's knowledge or interference. He'd used money from his personal savings, funds from before the marriage that were legally and entirely his own. We never spoke about it openly, but the understanding between us was clear. He saw me, even if no one else did. What Eleanor also didn't know was that I had been the one handling our parents' finances for the past 18 months. After my father's minor stroke, he'd asked me to help manage their accounts, pay their bills, and keep track of their investments. My mother knew I helped out occasionally, but she had no idea of the extent of my involvement. She still thought my father handled everything, and my father preferred it that way. I knew exactly how much money my parents had. I knew about the account my father kept separate. I knew that the Cancun trip was being funded almost entirely by that account because my mother had overspent their joint savings on redecorating the living room twice in 1 year. Armed with this knowledge, I made a phone call. "Dad, we need to talk." He came to my house that evening, alone. Patricia thought he was picking up medication from the pharmacy. We sat in my kitchen, and I laid out everything I was feeling, not with anger, but with a kind of calm clarity that comes from years of swallowing disappointment. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," I told him. "I'm asking you to see what's happening. I'm asking you to decide what kind of family you want to have." My father aged 10 years in front of me. His hands trembled slightly around his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I failed you. I know that. I've let your mother and your sister dictate things for so long because it was easier than fighting. But you're my daughter, too, and what they said today was wrong." We talked for 3 hours. He told me things about his marriage I'd never known. How he felt sidelined from the beginning. How my mother's attachment to Eleanor had always made him uncomfortable. How he tried to compensate by being present for me in smaller ways that wouldn't cause conflict. "When you were 7, he said, staring into his coffee cup like it contained memories rather than caffeine, "you made me a Father's Day card. Drew it yourself, wrote a poem inside. Your mother forgot to give it to me because she was so focused on the photo collage Eleanor had made, professionally printed at a shop, by the way, which your mother had orchestrated and paid for." I remembered that card vividly. Remembered spending hours on it with colored pencils. I found it 3 months later in a drawer in the kitchen. The envelope was still sealed. Your mother had never even opened it. His voice cracked slightly. That was the first time I seriously considered leaving. Not because of the card itself, but because of what it represented, the systematic erasure of everything you did that might compete with your sister for attention. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked. "Because I was afraid of what would happen to you if I did. I thought if I stayed, I could at least be a buffer. Give you someone in your corner, even if I couldn't do it openly." He looked up at me, his eyes wet. "I realize now that my silence probably hurt you as much as their favoritism. You needed someone to stand up and say it was wrong. And I just absorbed it like you did. We're alike that way." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You taught me how to survive it. That's not nothing. Surviving isn't the same as thriving. You deserve to thrive. You deserve parents who celebrated you instead of parents who made you feel like an afterthought." He squeezed my fingers. "I want to do something about it. Finally. I know it's 30 years too late, but I need to show you and show them that this isn't acceptable. Not anymore." By the end of the conversation, we had a new understanding and a plan of our own. 2 weeks before Christmas, Eleanor called to gloat. She didn't frame it that way, of course. She framed it as checking in and making sure you're okay with the arrangements. "We're leaving on the 22nd, she informed me cheerfully. "The kids are so excited. We've never done a beach Christmas before." Mom is beside herself with anticipation. "That sounds lovely," I said, and I meant it. "I hope you have a wonderful time." "You're really okay with this?" Eleanor sounded almost disappointed. She'd been expecting drama, protests, tears perhaps. My calm acceptance was throwing her off balance. "Of course. You were right that it's not practical for me to join. I've made my own plans, and I'm actually looking forward to a quiet holiday." She recovered quickly. "Well, good. That's very mature of you. Maybe next year we can figure something out. Maybe, I agreed. Have a safe flight. I hung up and smiled. The 22nd arrived. My father had handled everything with the precision of a man who'd spent decades learning when to act and when to stay silent. He'd moved a significant portion of his separate funds to a new account that only he could access. He'd had quiet conversations with his attorney about updating his will. He packed his bags and told my mother he'd be driving himself to the airport because he had errands to run first. What my mother didn't know, what Eleanor didn't know, was that Robert wasn't going to Cancun. He was coming to my house, where we'd planned a modest but meaningful Christmas of our own. The chaos began approximately 4 hours later. My mother called my father's cell phone when they landed. He didn't answer. She called again and again. By the 7th missed call, she was leaving voicemails that ranged from confused to frantic. Eleanor called me at 8 p.m. Where is Dad? I assume he's wherever he wants to be, I said calmly. Why? Is something wrong? He's not here. He never got on the flight. Mom is having a complete breakdown, and the resort is saying his name was never on the reservation. This was true. My father had quietly removed himself from the booking weeks ago and requested a refund for his portion. The resort had complied, and since my mother never looked at the actual confirmation details, she hadn't noticed. That's strange, I said, not offering any additional information. Do you know where he is? Have you talked to him? I talk to Dad regularly. We're close. Eleanor's voice turned sharp. Is he there? Is he at your house? I considered lying, but decided against it. The truth would be more devastating anyway. Yes, he's here. We're about to have dinner. Homemade lasagna, his favorite. The silence on the other end was profound. I could hear my mother wailing in the background. Brendan asking what was going on. One of the kids crying about something unrelated. Put him on the phone, Eleanor demanded. He doesn't want to talk right now. He asked me to let you know that he's safe and that he'll reach out after the new year. After the new year? This is insane. Mom is devastated. How could you do this? I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. He'd walked in from the living room, having heard my side of the conversation. He held out his hand for the phone. I gave it to him. Eleanor, it's Dad. His voice was calm, measured. I'm exactly where I want to be. Your mother and I will discuss this when she gets home, but I want you to understand something clearly. I am tired of watching my youngest daughter be treated like an afterthought. I'm tired of pretending I don't see the favoritism and the cruelty, and I am done being silent about it. Enjoy your vacation. We'll talk in January. He hung up. For a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of what had just happened settled around us like snowfall. Quiet, transformative, impossible to undo. Are you okay? I asked him. I'm terrified, he admitted. 41 years of marriage, and I've never directly defied your mother like this. Not once. Part of me wants to call back and apologize. Smooth everything over. Go back to the way things were. He set the phone on my kitchen counter and stepped back from it like it might bite. But the larger part of me feels lighter, like I've been carrying a weight I didn't even realize was crushing me. What do you think will happen when she gets back? Honestly, I have no idea. She might file for divorce. She might finally listen to what I've been too afraid to say for decades. She might pretend this never happened and expect me to do the same. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. Whatever happens, at least you'll know that I chose you. That when it mattered, I didn't stay silent. I hugged him then, really hugged him the way I hadn't since I was a child. He smelled like coffee and Old Spice, exactly as he had when I was small enough to sit on his shoulders at parades. "Thank you," I whispered into his shoulder. "For being here. For all of it. Thank you for giving me a reason to finally grow a spine." We laughed, and the tension broke, and we went back to the living room where a movie was paused and 2 plates of lasagna were getting cold. The rest of the evening was peaceful. We ate dinner, watched old movies, and talked about everything and nothing. My father told me stories about his childhood I'd never heard, about his dreams before he got married, about the small rebellions he'd staged throughout his life that no one had ever noticed. Christmas morning was quiet and joyful in a way I'd never experienced. No comparisons, no competitions, no carefully orchestrated moments of Eleanor's children opening presents while I was expected to watch and coo appropriately. Just 2 people who loved each other, sharing a holiday without pretense. We woke up late, something that never happened at traditional family Christmases, where the children's excitement had everyone up before dawn. I made blueberry pancakes while my father brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint. We exchanged gifts in the living room, nothing extravagant, just thoughtful items we knew the other would appreciate. He gave me a first edition of my favorite childhood book, one I'd mentioned loving years ago and assumed he'd forgotten. I gave him a leather journal and a nice pen, knowing he'd always wanted to write down his thoughts, but never felt he had permission to take time for himself. "Your mother always said journaling was self-indulgent," he admitted, running his fingers over the journal's cover. "That I should be focused on productive activities, not navel-gazing." Writing isn't navel-gazing. It's processing. It's understanding yourself better so you can show up better for others. He looked at me with something like wonder. "When did you get so wise?" "Therapy. Lots and lots of therapy." We both laughed, and he tucked the journal carefully beside him like it was something precious. Around noon, we bundled up and took a walk through my neighborhood. Snow had fallen overnight, covering everything in pristine white, and the streets were quiet with that particular Christmas hush that descends when everyone is inside with their families. We talked about nothing important, the architecture of various houses, memories from holidays long past, his opinions on the neighborhood's Christmas decorations. It was the most peaceful Christmas morning of my entire life. Meanwhile, in Cancun, the situation had deteriorated significantly. I learned the details later from multiple sources, pieced together from frantic texts, overheard phone calls, and eventually a very enlightening conversation with my Aunt Laura, who'd gotten the full story from my mother's tearful recounting. My mother had spent the first 2 days of the trip alternating between rage and despair. She blamed me entirely, convinced that I had manipulated my father into abandoning her. Eleanor fed this narrative enthusiastically, painting herself as the victim of her sister's vindictiveness. Brendan, to his minimal credit, had suggested multiple times that perhaps they should try to enjoy the vacation they'd paid for, but his input was dismissed as insensitive. The children were confused and cranky, picking up on the adults' tension without understanding it. Chloe asked repeatedly when Grandpa was coming, and each question sent my mother into fresh tears. By Christmas Eve, the family vacation had devolved into something resembling a group therapy session without a therapist. Eleanor had demanded that my mother confront my father over video call, which Patricia attempted to do at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. My father declined the call. He sent a text instead, "I love you, but I'm not interested in being screamed at. We'll talk when you've had time to calm down. Merry Christmas." This did not help matters. The children were the true casualties of the adults' dysfunction. 9-year-old Chloe apparently spent most of the trip asking when Grandpa was arriving, unable to understand why the vacation he'd been promised had turned into days of whispered arguments and his grandmother crying by the pool. 6-year-old Daisy, picking up on the tension without comprehending it, had multiple meltdowns that exhausted everyone further. On Christmas Day itself, Eleanor made a decision that would prove to be spectacularly ill-advised. She posted a lengthy screed on social media about family betrayal, toxic siblings who couldn't handle not being the center of attention, and the importance of protecting your children from negative influences. She didn't name me directly, but she didn't need to. Everyone who knew our family understood exactly who she was talking about. The response was not what she anticipated. Comments began rolling in. Some from distant relatives, some from family friends, some from people who had watched our dynamic play out over the years. Not all of them were sympathetic to Eleanor. Aunt Laura, my mother's own sister, commented publicly, "Maybe if you hadn't excluded her from the trip entirely, none of this would have happened. Actions have consequences, dear." Uncle Michael, my father's brother, whom I'd always liked but rarely saw, sent me a private message, "Good for Robert. It's about time someone stood up to that nonsense. You've always been the kind one in that family. Don't let them make you feel guilty." The social media post was deleted within 6 hours, but the damage was done. Eleanor had inadvertently broadcast their family dysfunction to everyone they knew, and not everyone had sided with her. Screenshots, of course, had already been taken. The internet never truly forgets, and at least 3 different family members had preserved Eleanor's rant before she thought better of it. These screenshots made their way through various group chats and private messages, spreading the story far beyond what Eleanor had intended. A cousin I barely knew sent me a message. Finally, someone called them out. "Your mom has been insufferable about Eleanor since we were kids. My mom used to come home from family reunions and vent for hours about the favoritism. An old family friend from my parents' church reached out. Your father was always the reasonable one. I hope he finds peace. Whatever happens with Patricia, and I hope you know that plenty of people see you and value you, even if your immediate family hasn't always shown it." The outpouring of quiet support was unexpected and deeply moving. For years, I'd assumed I was the only one who noticed the dysfunction, that everyone else bought into the narrative my mother and Eleanor had constructed. Learning that others had seen it, had been bothered by it, shifted something fundamental in my understanding of my own history. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't oversensitive. The dynamic had been exactly as unfair as I'd perceived it to be, and other people had witnessed it, too. On December 27th, my father received a text from Brendan, the first and only direct communication from his son-in-law during the entire ordeal. "Robert, I don't know what's going on between you and the family, but Eleanor is devastated and your wife hasn't stopped crying since Christmas Eve. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Please consider coming down here for the last few days. We can still salvage this." My father showed me the message, his expression unreadable. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to know why Brendan thinks devastation and tears should change my position. As if their emotional discomfort is more important than 3 decades of your emotional neglect." He deleted the message without responding. If they want to have a conversation about what went wrong, I'm open to that. But I'm not going to be guilted into pretending everything is fine just because they're unhappy with the consequences of their choices. I'd never been prouder of him. The family returned from Cancun on December 28th. My father had moved back home by then, though he was sleeping in the guest room and had made clear to my mother that significant changes would need to occur before they resumed normal relations. I expected anger. I expected accusations. I expected Eleanor to show up at my door with a list of grievances and demands for an apology. What I got was something different. The first few days of January passed in intense silence. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. My father kept me updated on the situation at home. My mother was barely speaking to him, sleeping in the master bedroom while he took the guest room. Their interactions limited to essential household logistics. "She's processing," he told me during one of our phone calls. "I can see her working through it, trying to figure out how to respond. Part of her wants to rage, but I think she knows that won't work this time. She's not used to consequences, and she's trying to understand what this new landscape looks like." I asked if he regretted what he'd done. The pause before his answer was long enough that I braced myself for disappointment. "I regret that it took me this long," he finally said. "I regret every Christmas you spent feeling like an outsider in your own family. I regret not speaking up the first time, the 10th time, the 100th time your mother dismissed you in favor of your sister. But I don't regret this Christmas. This was the first holiday in decades where I felt like I was being true to myself, to my values, to the father I always wanted to be. His words settled into me like warmth on a cold day. My mother called me on New Year's Eve. Her voice was small, tentative, utterly unlike the confident woman who had nodded along while her eldest daughter excluded me from Christmas. "I need to understand something," she said. "Your father told me. He said you've been managing our finances for the past 18 months. He said you helped him after his stroke when I was too overwhelmed to deal with the paperwork. He said a lot of things I didn't know." "All true," I confirmed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I considered the question carefully. "Because you never asked. Because every conversation we have somehow turns back to Eleanor and her needs. Because I learned a long time ago that being useful was the closest I was going to get to being valued in this family." My mother was crying. I could hear it in her breathing, the soft hiccups she always made when she was genuinely upset rather than performing emotion. "I didn't realize." "I never meant, I know you didn't mean to," I said. And surprisingly, I meant it. But intent doesn't erase impact. I've spent my entire adult life being treated as less important, less worthy of consideration, less family. That barbecue in August wasn't a one-time thing. It was the culmination of a lifetime of smaller cuts that I've been pretending didn't hurt. The conversation lasted an hour. My mother made no promises I would have believed anyway, but she listened in a way she never had before. Perhaps my father's dramatic gesture had finally cracked through the carefully constructed worldview she'd maintained for so long. Eleanor predictably handled things differently. She showed up at my house on January 3rd, unannounced, with fire in her eyes and righteousness in her voice. I saw her car pull into the driveway and considered not answering the door, but decided against avoidance. This conversation was going to happen eventually. Better to control the circumstances. "How could you?" she demanded the moment I opened the door. "How could you turn Dad against his own family? How could you ruin our Christmas?" I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Come inside. I'm not having this conversation where my neighbors can hear." She pushed past me into the foyer, practically vibrating with fury. Behind her, I could see Brendan waiting in the car, apparently too cowardly to participate in the confrontation directly. "You planned this?" Eleanor accused. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Manipulating Dad, turning him against Mom, making yourself into some kind of martyr." "I planned nothing," I said calmly. "I was told I wasn't welcome on the family vacation. I accepted that. Dad made his own choice about how to respond. He never would have done this without you pushing him. That's the thing, Eleanor. You've spent so long believing that Dad has no agency, that he just goes along with whatever Mom wants, that you forgot he's actually a person with his own thoughts and feelings. He was angry about how you treated me. He was angry long before I said anything." She wasn't listening. She'd never been good at listening when the information contradicted her preferred narrative. "You're jealous," she spat. "You've always been jealous that I have a family and you don't, that I have children who love me, and you're going to die alone in this big, empty house." I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Eleanor, I have a house I own outright, a career that fulfills me, friends who actually like me rather than tolerating me out of obligation, and a relationship with our father that's honest and loving. You have a husband who couldn't even be bothered to come inside with you, children you use as props to demand special treatment, and a mother whose approval you've had to constantly work to maintain because deep down you know it was never really earned." Her face went red, then white. Nobody had ever spoken to her this way. I'd certainly never dared to before. "Get out of my house," I continued, my voice still calm. "You're not welcome here until you're ready to have an honest conversation about our family dynamics. And that includes acknowledging your part in them, not just pointing fingers at everyone else. Mom will never forgive you for this." Eleanor hissed. "Maybe not. But Dad already has. And frankly, his opinion is the only one I care about right now." She left. I watched her storm back to the car, watched Brendan's expression as she presumably recounted the conversation, watched them drive away in a spray of gravel that did minor damage to my driveway. Worth it. The following week brought unexpected developments. My mother, rather than continuing her campaign of outrage, went quiet. I learned later from my father that she'd spent 3 days barely speaking, moving through the house like a ghost, picking up framed family photos, and staring at them for long stretches before setting them down again. On January 7th, she asked my father to recommend a therapist. Not couples counseling, not yet, just someone she could talk to alone about things she'd never examined before. He gave her the name of a psychologist a colleague had recommended, and she made an appointment for the following week. I don't know exactly what happened in those sessions. My mother and I haven't reached a point where she shares that kind of vulnerability with me, and I'm not sure we ever will. But something shifted. The woman who'd spent 40 years certain of her own righteousness began slowly to question the foundations of that certainty. My father reported small changes. She stopped automatically defending Eleanor in conversations. She asked questions about my life, genuine questions, not performative ones designed to check a box. She cried one night while looking through old photo albums, pointing out picture after picture where Eleanor was front and center while I hovered at the edges or was absent entirely. "I didn't even notice," she told my father. "I was holding the camera, choosing the shots, and I didn't even notice that I was erasing her." Progress is rarely linear, and I'm not naive enough to think decades of ingrained behavior will disappear because of one dramatic Christmas. But the cracks in my mother's certainty give me something I haven't felt toward her in years: hope. Not hope that we'll suddenly become close, but hope that perhaps before she dies, she'll understand what she did. And maybe, just maybe, genuinely apologize for it. Eleanor remains unconvinced that anything needs to change. In her version of events, she's the victim of a coordinated attack by a jealous sister and a father having some kind of late-life crisis. She's told this story to anyone who will listen, apparently unaware that each retelling reveals more about her character than mine. The aftermath of that Christmas has stretched into the present day, reshaping our family in ways both painful and necessary. My parents are in couples counseling, my father's condition for remaining in the marriage. My mother is learning, slowly and reluctantly, that her lifelong favoritism had consequences she never anticipated. Eleanor and I don't speak. I'm okay with that. Perhaps one day she'll be ready to acknowledge her role in our arrangement, but I'm not holding my breath. Some people never learn to see past their own reflection. My relationship with my father has never been stronger. He comes over for dinner every Wednesday, and we talk honestly about everything: his marriage, my life, the family we wish we'd had versus the family we actually have. He tells me often that standing up at Christmas was the hardest and best thing he'd ever done. I've had therapy of my own, processing years of accumulated hurt that I packed away in boxes labeled "deal with later." The therapist has been helpful in understanding that my anger was justified, that my response was proportionate, and that setting boundaries isn't the same as cruelty. Some nights, I wonder if I went too far, if there was a gentler way to make my point, a softer approach that might have preserved more relationships while still asserting my worth. Then, I remember my mother nodding along while Eleanor uninvited me from Christmas. I remember being told that families with children deserve consideration I didn't merit. I remember 30 years of being second best in a race I never asked to run. The house is quiet around me as I finish writing this. Outside my window, snow is falling gently, covering the lawn I maintained myself, the garden I planted myself, the life I built myself without help from anyone except a father who loved me enough to finally show it. Eleanor can have her beach vacations and her performative social media posts about perfect families. My mother can have her favorite daughter and all the complicated feelings that come with finally seeing the cost of that favoritism. I'll take Christmas morning in my own home with people who actually want to be there, and the knowledge that for the first time in my life, I didn't accept less than I deserved. What would you have done in my shoes?